Man's first crime was murder, and that day killing has started and become a constant part and fabric of our own culture. According to one source, last year, approximately 35,000 Americans in the year 2023 had their lives taken by someone else against their will. They were murdered. Now, if we believe those numbers, that means before you and I get up and go to work tomorrow, approximately 100 of our fellow citizens that are alive now will be dead by the time we get up to go to work because their lives have been snuffed out by someone else. If we were to add to that list murders of another kind, such as abortion or euthanasia or suicide, then the numbers are staggering. To give you a comparison, those numbers, along with homicides added to it, in 1 year would be enough to fill Arrowhead Stadium to capacity. And yet, we live with that. If murder is not done on a massive scale or bizarre or committed by some celebrity, we rarely hear of it. A week ago, I was struck when I, like so many of you, watched our president deliver his State of the Union address. And I am a weirdo, so let me just say that. I am a weirdo because I earn my living on oratory. I critique communication. And I have my opinions about some people who think certain people are great communicators and I think they're lousy, and other people that think they're lousy and I think they're great. In an interesting moment in that State of the Union, the president went off script. Not uncharacteristic of him, but interesting in the moment he did go off script. Whether he intended to or not, I don't know, but it was in a reference to the murder of Laken Riley. And he referred to the murderer of Laken Riley as an illegal. That was not in his stated State of the Union address. I have a copy. And he went off script. And you can remember, if you've kept up with the news in the last week, that the political left have excoriated the president because of that term. Some have excused him and said, well, he didn't mean to say that. Others said, well, I think it's inappropriate for him to say that word. They much would have preferred the term undocumented. And so there's been this tit for tat with the president and his press corps, the political left of our country, in the last half week. And finally, his press secretary came out and said he meant what he said, he stands by it, and that didn't pacify a number on the political left. And what struck me in all this is no one is talking about Laken Riley, who was murdered. A young woman, innocent, not asked to be murdered. Whether or not this gentleman was illegal or not, at this point is irrelevant. A young, innocent woman's life was taken, never to be brought back again. And no one is debating that on this particular issue. And this is where we're at. It is no wonder that Pope John Paul II, before he died, referred to this generation as the culture of death. We're obsessed with it. And our text today in Exodus 20, verse 13, is much like a Hershey's Kiss on the top of a sugar cookie. It's short, sweet, and to the point. So much so that the original Hebrew actually is only 2 words. Not kill is how the original translates it. While each commandment, no doubt, has its own controversy based upon culture, I am struck by the fact that most people in culture that approach the 10 Commandments approach it when I was a 5th grader reading Choose Your Own Adventure books. that we can interpret it based upon any given situation and any particular mood we're in. So someone from culture looks at commandment number 1, for example, and says, I don't believe in one God. I believe in many gods. Anything that gets us to heaven is fine with me. Or some say, I don't believe in any gods at all, and I'm just peachy keen. Other people look at commandment number 7 and say, I'm going to sleep with who I want, and it's my body, my choice, and I'm fine and dandy with that. But this commandment is so short and clean that it cannot be controversial. It's like trying to convince someone the sky is purple. It can't be done. Or can it? When we involve pagans in God's redemptive plan of things, pagans will always do what they do. They're pesky about this. They act like pagans. And they completely jack up God's redemptive plan, like 2 rabid dogs at a poodle beauty competition. If you were to go to lunch after worship today and poll 100 people at the restaurant you go to and ask them, is murder wrong? No doubt, most, if not all, would say yes. You would have a couple of smart alecks that would say it depends. But most still believe that murder is wrong to some degree. If you were to ask them, why is killing someone and taking their life wrong? Then you get a wide variety of answers. Some would say, well, it's just not a nice thing to do to take someone's life. Others would say, well, we should always treat people the way we want to treat. Other people would say, well, what kind of civilization will we have if it's like the Old West? We just go around killing people indiscriminately. We wouldn't have a safe, healthy culture. And all these might be good, to which then leads another question. Who is to say whether murder is right or wrong? Is it you? Is it situational ethics? Is it culture? This is where we find ourselves today. And thus, for people outside this church, pagans, the 6th commandment takes on a completely different look than how the redeemed look at it. For example, who is to say in culture today that your life being snuffed out would actually make this world a better place if you didn't exist anymore? You think, how could you say that? That's precisely what unbelieving pagan culture is saying today, in a variety of ways. Well, this makes us comfortable. Well, let me give you an example. I have a human being in my belly, says a woman. But I don't want this human being to come into the world. This human being has no value. It should not be protected. I don't want it to exist. And therefore, I'm going to eliminate it from coming into this world. It's not worth my protection. My body, my choice. Which, by the way, I do agree with that statement to some degree. I wish it was consistent during COVID, but that's a whole nother sermon. Now, no abortionist is going to say exactly what I just said. But their moral ground gives justification precisely of how I said it, of why they kill babies. Or another. Mom is 92 years old, and she really is past her prime. Life was better years ago, and she sits in a chair and she drools at the TV incoherently. She really doesn't know what's going on. And mom, by the way, this is hypothetical, not my mom, but mom is, she takes insurance benefits. She goes to the doctor all the time. She's in chronic pain. She takes medicines. All that healthier, younger people could benefit from. Let's just take mom, give her a pill, and let her die. Now again, no one would say that like that, but going on right now in the nation of the Netherlands, where euthanasia is now constitutional and legalized, that is the justification for taking people's life. Or another one. There is a particular race that is coming into our country, infecting it, corrupting it, distorting it, creating a mongrel culture. That race needs to be gotten rid of and eliminated. That was the rationale of Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. They might not say it like that, but that is the justification for killing Jews by the tens of thousands. This is all fervor of why, beloved, it is important to read the Ten Commandments redemptively, not fundamentally from a moralistic standpoint. This is a conversation that God is having with His newly redeemed people. So says verse 1. And it's how we treat one another. And as God's people, we must recognize in matters of life and death, and we need to recognize it quickly today if we don't recognize it yet, that every human life, no matter if they agree with us or not, no matter what their race, what their gender, what their economic status, no matter if they're bothersome to you or not, every human being is created in the image of God. And as such, fundamentally, every human being, regardless if they admit that or not, has value. And if any people on earth should prop that up and value life, it should be those who've experienced not only life, but new life in Christ. Not because the government tells us. That is a slippery slope. We find ourselves right there. Just because, or let me say it this way, Uriah's death is not justified because David was head of the government and said it was right because he wanted Bathsheba. God didn't think so. And so we as His redeemed people should value life. And we'll get to that in a moment. Israel, coming out of a culture of death, understood what it meant to be redeemed. Now, the Hebrew word here, back to verse 13, rasah, is always used, every time it's used, and it's the most popular word for homicide. In the Old Testament, it is always used for unlawful killing. That is what we're told not to do as God's redeemed people. Interestingly, and this is perhaps for lunch or for emails or for another time, the word here used, rasah, the most popular word, is never once used for capital punishment, for self-defense, or for just wars. Those are different terms. So the seventh commandment, or the sixth commandment, does not have in mind those cases. We could add other issues the Bible talks about in other places that I have aforementioned, abortion, suicide, and euthanasia, and add to that, to this list. But what the sixth commandment does prohibit is probably what you're thinking of, what we would call premeditated, deliberate homicide. It's used in other ways, but that is the primary way. It's Cain planning to kill Abel at a certain place in a certain time and then doing it. It's Ahab planning to kill Naboth and take his vineyard at a certain place at a certain time and doing it. It's David killing Uriah. So it's premeditated, pre-planned to kill someone. And this word is used of doing a disservice to people. It is also used in what we would call cases of involuntary manslaughter. There's actually chapters in Deuteronomy dedicated to this as a violation of the you will not kill command. These would not be premeditated acts of killing, but they would be nevertheless planned. So Deuteronomy 9 speaks of this. And in our day, it would be like a guy who hangs out at a bar, he gets drunk, he takes the keys to his car, he gets in that car, he drives down the road, he strikes a family of 5, killing them all. Now, he didn't set out to deliberately kill that family, he doesn't know who they are, but he's nevertheless charged with murder because what he did is a reckless, planned deed of getting drunk. And the Bible speaks to these events and calls it murder in Deuteronomy 9. A final category is what we might call issues of careless activity that leads to the death of someone at our hands because of our negligence. Next chapter, in chapter 21, we have this very curious example of an ox getting loose and goring someone. And the owner is held responsible because they knew about this ox. They didn't take care of it. They didn't fence it in. They didn't, get rid of it. They knew it was a liability and they were reckless anyway. In Deuteronomy, you read about vanguards surrounding rooftops because rooftops back then were flat. People went out and sunbathed or slept, and they actually had safety rails. And there's an example there in Deuteronomy where if you don't put a vanguard and your neighbor falls off that porch and kills themselves, you're responsible for that. And this is under penalty of this command. And before I came to Calvary, the good folks of Calvary actually used to run a daycare. And they had a playground out on the west side of the property out here. And the good people of Calvary decided to get rid of that playground because there either wasn't a fence around it or there wasn't signage, and the people were afraid that 7:30 on a Tuesday night when no one's here, some neighbor kids will go to the playground, swing on a swing, the swing will break, one kid will fall on its head, killing them, and the church will be sued, will be liable. There's actually state laws in the law of Kansas, in the state of Kansas, about having a fence around your swimming pool, your own private swimming pool with signage on it. And again, it deals with this issue of negligence and carelessness of loss of life. All of these talked about of you will not kill command. Now, for the time that we have, we understand what this command means. How, as redeemed people of Calvary Baptist Church, do we use this to value life? First, let me say that God's people have been given new life, so we should promote it. God's people have been given new life, so we should promote it. This gets back now to the context of Exodus 20, verse 1, where God identifies himself as the one who redeemed you from the land or the house of bondage. Now, we remember reading Exodus. How does Exodus start off? Do you remember chapter 1? You have the pagan ruler in a pagan land not liking Israel, scared of Israel actually because they're populating. And he shows that he has no value of human life. So he takes the most vulnerable human alive, a newborn baby, and he throws them into the Nile River if there happen to be Israelite boys. Clean, that will take care of it. Let's just do it and take care of our problem. That is the culture that Israel's coming out of. On top of that, in chapter 5 and 6 of Exodus, you recall, they complain that they're overworked. They're treated like slaves. Property, not human. And they complain that they're overworked, and instead of giving them Sabbath rest, because he's pagan, Pharaoh says, you're not worked enough. And so he works them even more. And that is the life that these people came out of. You talk about a culture of death. They lived it. Some of them don't have baby boys or baby grandsons, as long as that was, because of this edict by Pharaoh in chapter 1. So they live the culture of death. Yahweh comes from heaven, rescues from this, and his claim to fame, verse 1 of chapter 20, is, I have redeemed you. I brought you out of that culture of death. I've given you new life. Here's how people that have new life treat one another. And so all of these commands, particularly starting with last week, are about our value of humans, right? Kids, we don't give our parents lip. Why? Because we value them. We don't have affairs with anyone that walks or crawls. Why? Because we value them. We don't steal people's things because we value them. And we don't take our hands, wrap it around people's throat, and suck the very life out of their body because we value them. Why? Because we're redeemed people who have been given new life. That's the context here. So, how, as redeemed people who have been given new life, should we promote it at Calvary? Allow me to give you 3 ways. These are things I was thinking through and jotted down this week. And all 3 deal with the heart of this command. They're actually used. The command is used in 2 of the accounts. First, if you're taking notes or you want to recall these, Calvary, we promote life, or in order to promote life, guard your heart. Here is where we come to our greatest teacher, the greatest preacher who ever lived, preaching the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. If you turn over to that sermon in Matthew chapter 5, you'll recall, just to talk about this, by the way, is chapter 6. I said chapter 5. Where at the beginning of this sermon, this would be chapter 5:21, Jesus said to his followers, unless your righteousness surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not make it to heaven. That is the key line to all of the Sermon on the Mount. It is meant to shock them because the natural response is, well, we can't possibly have righteousness that surpasses the scribes and Pharisees. They fast twice a week. They pray. Their heads are in the Bible. They're the moral compass of our nation. They're always looking and praying for the coming Messiah. We can't surpass that. And Jesus has got them right where he wants them. You're right. Your morality can't. So this is why the issue of the heart dominates the Sermon on the Mount. It's everywhere. And Jesus is saying, only I can give you a new heart. And this is why he does this famous, you have heard it said, but I say to you. The problem with the breaking of the 10 Commandments, Jesus mentioned some of them directly, one right here in chapter 6, verse 21, is the problem of the human heart. So verse 21 of chapter 6, you have heard, it was said in an older generation, do not murder. There's the quote, right out of Exodus 20, verse 13. And whoever murders will be subject to judgment. Well, that's what all these moralists are saying. We haven't committed homicide. None of us are like Jeffrey Dahmer. We're good. God likes us. We're going to heaven. We're his people because we're not like Jeffrey Dahmer. And Jesus says, but I say to you, this is verse 22, that anyone who is angry with a brother will be subject to judgment. Whoever insults a brother will be brought before the council. Whoever says fool will be sent to fiery hell. And then he gives an example we'll talk about in a moment. So Jesus screws in the conscience even more to say, look, murder exists because anger is unrestrained. If you control anger in your heart, no one kills anybody. So you think because you haven't violated by committing homicide that you're okay, but I'm saying you got a lot of anger in your heart, and that's where murder comes from. Long before anyone pulls the trigger of a gun, Long before anyone takes out another life, they're seething about that person. They're bitter. They're angry. They're miserable. And Jesus says this is a problem of the heart. And he actually gives examples. I'll show you what anger looks like. You're insulting people. Anger comes out by what you say long before you commit an act of homicide. The word in the Old English is raka. That's hard to get one meaning, but it basically means intellectual insults. It's calling someone a blockhead, a numbskull, an idiot, an imbecile. The other, fool, is not an intellectual insult. It's a moral one. Remember, a fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Calling someone a fool is not calling them like they're dumb, bad IQ. It's saying that you're morally bankrupt. The reason you're doing that is because you're not close to God like we are. And that's what anger does. It blurts out these insults. And Jesus says, you need to guard your heart. Well, confession is good for the soul, so here we go. My kids are really my moral and spiritual barometers. If I did not have my kids in my life, I would probably be a vagrant. Although you could say, well, you weren't before them. But they are always on to me about things I do. Not always on to me. They are occasionally on to me by things a particular thing I do. And Noah will be smiling, and Emma, when she hears this, will be smiling, because they know exactly what I do, because they're always saying, Dad, I have many vices in my life, and I have a lot of problems, and I'm working on it because of sanctification. One is something that drives me bananas, completely up a wall, is by people who can't drive. And I'm like you, I get on the road every day of my life, and I drive a lot of distances. And there are some times where some drivers need to be off the road because they are a deliberate danger to people. They run through red lights, they're driving erratically. But more often than not, again, because I'm always honest with you, my insults of them are based upon what I think a good driver should be, not what God says. So I will blurt out things that I'm not proud of. Now, nothing profane. I'm not a cusser, okay? But I'll let you know what I blurt out so you can pray for me and help me with this problem that Jesus clearly is telling me about here. Clearly, when I read this, it's like, okay, I see, Jesus, thank you. We'll try to do better with your help. When a person cuts out in front of me, like on a side, if I'm headed one direction and they're on a side street, and they cut out in front of me, and I'm from here to, say, the Comptons, that's a problem, but then they slow down. Or another one, a woman is driving and she's on her cell phone. So I violate Jesus' edict by intellectual insults. My favorite, I think, is you idiot. A second favorite is go get a license and learn how to drive. And a third favorite is, where is the police when we need them to pull this moron over? So we have this pesky little thing called the Bible. And here is Jesus saying to me, Brian, that guy you just called an idiot may be smarter than you. He may have a higher IQ than you. He may be more who are you to judge him? And that woman on her cell phone may be calling because it's an emergency. She may be headed to the hospital because she's pregnant. Who are you to judge her? So as I say, I'm working on this. To promote life, Jesus says, guard your heart. Long before homicide happens, seething, unrestrained anger works its magic. Second, to promote life, love your neighbor. If we're looking at Matthew 6 right now, the whole section starting in verse 23 and ending in verse 26 is about this very issue. Reconcile! Are you kidding me? What kind of dysfunctional relationship that depends on bitterness? Reconcile with your brother. Get rid of it. Well, there's another story Jesus tells you. For sake of time, we won't turn there because you know it anyway. It's the most often quoted story in all of the Gospels, the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus brings up the issue of murder in the Good Samaritan, right? You have a Jew that gets walking along a torrential road, gets jumped, beat up, at least it just says a party. So a bunch of thugs jump him, and clearly they show they have no value for his life because they take his stuff and they leave him for dead. And the story goes on where some religious scribes walk by, and who knows, maybe they're on their way to church, probably on their way to teach a systematic theology class in a seminary, and so people can't bother them. Or who knows what they're doing. But nevertheless, these Jew boys who have their head in the Bible, who know what to do, see them and probably think, he deserved that, let's move on. And they leave him for dead. And a Samaritan, who would think that a Samaritan and the Jews that are like oil and water, a Samaritan comes by, picks him up, pays for his bills, pays for a place to stay, soothes his wounds, and gives him convalescence. And Jesus teaches this as the antidote against murder, which is what's happening, the attempt, is love your neighbor. Now again, let me just state, what I'm about to say, I am not in the mood, I'm not in the habit of making people feel guilty because of pastoral manipulation. I came out of a Christian school, we're heavily legalistic, and we did that and wrote the book on it. So if I make you feel guilty, that is not what I want to do. Because these are just examples of where as a church, I think we can help promote life by loving our neighbor. Number one, you can love your neighbor in the home. This fits perfect of the previous command last week. If we believe statistics that a 15-year-old, by the age of 15, a boy will see more acts of violence by the age of 15 than at any time in American history, then we might want to begin to think about how to love our neighbors at home, our children. For example, okay, here we go. I'm not against video games. I grew up on Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and Galaga, okay? I spent hours lawn mowing money playing video. My son plays video games. I play with him. There's a great Western game we're playing right now. So please don't hear me. But 1 out of every 2 video games that you kids are playing are acts of repeated violence, blowing a guy's head off, decapitating people, massive violence. And then they go listen to music that promotes violence, particularly against women, and then go watch as a film, a movie that has all sorts of indiscriminate act of violence, and they're surrounded by this violent culture. And so it's not an accident that now, particularly in public schools, we have violent cases of students committing violent acts against their teachers. Just since January 1, I've been aware of national news. One case where a junior in high school, a football player, picked up his 62-year-old United States history teacher and body slammed him on the floor, giving him a massive concussion and head trauma. Another in February across the nation occurred when a male student ran down a female teacher in the hall, blindsided her from behind, knocking her down, and repeatedly kicking her in the stomach and in the head, then spitting on her. And one that occurred this month of a female student who pepper sprayed her male English teacher. When he fell to his knees, writhing in agony, she continued to pepper spray him. Every act was linked to each teacher took away their cell phone. So we're now teaching a culture where stuff is to be more valued than human life. And it is not an accident we got there. So let's promote loving our neighbor through the home. Second, we should love our neighbor of the most vulnerable, love our most vulnerable neighbors. And I am going to mention here, that is the unborn. I am so thankful for Miss Ruth Tisdale and Jonathan and others who volunteer at Advice and Aid Pregnancy Center, a pregnancy center that we support through various acts of ministry. I was just at a pastor's luncheon with Miss Ruth led and her team, and I was absolutely amazed at the many ministries available to this church that we should tap into for the cause of the unborn. I can never understand the abortion movement that tells women, we love you, so kill other women in your womb. That makes no sense to me. It's not only evil, it's irrational. We say we love women. And because of that, we want to save women in your belly, not kill them, in the name of promoting women's rights. That's absurd. But it's being done relentlessly. When more murders are committed through acts of abortion since the original overturn of Roe v. Wade in the 70s, and those baby slaughters actually overwhelm numbers of men that died in Vietnam, Persian Gulf, or Operation Desert Storm, we have a serious problem in our country. So we want to promote life in this church by partnering and continuing to pray for people like... By the way, this just came to me because of something Miss Ruth told to me privately. So Miss Ruth, would you stand? I want you to... Everyone in this room knows who Miss Ruth is. If you don't, okay, Miss Ruth, you can be seated. We want to continue to pray for her. This is what I'm going to say. If you are a woman that has had an abortion, I don't know, but if you have had an abortion because we value your life now, and you are struggling with, however long ago that was, struggling with the enormity of guilt, go talk to Miss Ruth. I don't need to know about it, but the last thing we want to promote life is for one or maybe several of you in this room to be dominated by such guilt. Trust me, you're in the right place. Jesus comes for you to liberate that. So in our crusade to promote life at all, in all fabrics, we also want to love our neighbor. Finally, these are just not notes I jotted down from my own life, I guess. Those neighbors that are not like us. We must always remember, especially today, where any sort of difference of opinion is looked at through vitriolic hatred. Homosexuals, for example, are created in the image of God, not as homosexuals, but as human beings. They are not animal, vegetable, or mineral. They're not below us. And so when we start conversations with people that are completely opposite end of the gospel spectrum, pagans, we must begin with valuing their life in human dignity created in the image of God. Look how Jesus operated. In no way, shape, or form did he compromise his convictions. It was always get these people to the gospel. But notice, he actually talks to a woman from Samaria. He actually talks to a woman and does not condemn the one in adultery. He actually talks to a moralist by night and doesn't call him an imbecile. So Christians especially, in our conversations with pagans, need to remind ourselves that we should love our neighbors. This does not mean we capitulate to truth. I don't want anyone to hear me say that. But it does mean that they are created in the image of God like you and I. We're no better. They're a human being just like us. And if we value human life, we must value all lives for the sake of the gospel. Which brings me to my final point. To promote life, guard your heart, love your neighbor, and loosen your tongue. Here, I'll end with going back quickly to Exodus chapter 19, only to fast forward to the New Testament. So you can either turn back there or just listen to me. This is by way of reminder of the whole purpose of God giving Israel these commandments of his redemption. He mentions this in the critical line of chapter 19, beginning in verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. You will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That is the design that God has for his redeemed people, to make you so special, so holy, like mine, that all pagans, because the whole earth is mine, but I'm only choosing you for this special assignment, that all of the pagan nations can see that you're distinctive, you're special, you're not like pagans, and they can be attracted to that and be brought into the Abrahamic family. That's the whole purpose of this redemption. Well, Peter takes this same verse and applies it to the church in the New Testament. He actually quotes from it when he says to the church, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, God's own people. And he has chosen you so that you may proclaim the excellencies of the one who's called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. God has redeemed us so that we go back into a world and proclaim that life-giving redemption. And that is centered and focused around the person and work of Jesus Christ. And what happened to Jesus, ironically? He was murdered. We are bizarre people, Christians. We're stuck between two worlds, as John Stott said. So in a moment, and every week we do this, by the way, we celebrate with a symbol, a feast that talks about the murder of Jesus, right? We have broken body and shed blood. And so our whole faith is centered on a killing. And by the way, the preaching of Peter at Pentecost and of Stephen talks about this to their audience members. This Jesus, whom you crucified, is Lord and Christ. So it's one thing to say Jesus did not die, he was killed, which is right, but it's a whole other thing to say he wasn't killed, he died, which would be right too. But our faith is centered around Jesus, who at the hands of sinful men was brutally tortured, unmercilessly so, and killed. The Lord of life, the one who created them, is snuffed out because of rage. And yet, this Jesus did what no other being has done. He rose from the dead. He did not stay dead. He was not a martyr. He was not a good guy who just sadly lost his life unjustly. He is God who rose and conquered death and takes our death And as Paul would say, shockingly, but thank God for it, murderers, whom Paul was, we used to be that, but we have been washed and justified in the gospel. And so, beloved, today we go and we proclaim this gospel to a world that Jesus Christ's death and resurrection gives you new life. If you're here today and you need new life because of sins you've done, because of things you haven't done, it is only found in Jesus, period. Now, I cannot help but today, America tends to be more Irish than the Irish, but this is St. Patrick's Day. My kids desperately wanted me to wear my kilt to church today. But I thought, well, I will have church members calling for my head if I wear my kilt. Besides, it's Scottish, not Irish. St. Patrick, who has very little to do with corned beef and green and shamrocks, and who ironically wasn't even Irish, he was English, was captured. He was kidnapped when he was a teenager, held 10 years for ransom by an Irish warlord whose reputation was murder and killing. Patrick thought, I'm next, but he became a slave instead. He escaped, went back to England, and eventually came to Christ. And he sensed the call to go back to Ireland and give the gospel to the Irish warlords. I've told you this story, I think. He goes back to Ireland armed with a Bible and a copy of the Nicene Creed. That's all he has. He will use iconoclastic methods. He'll use the shamrock. He'll use the mistletoe. He'll use the holly leaf. He'll use Dane type things because they're illiterate before he teaches them literacy through the Bible. But he brings a Bible and the Nicene Creed and the gospel. And Patrick shares the gospel with the very warlord who kidnapped him, winning him to Christ. Eventually, through one man, without any social media, one man in the pre-medieval age leads over 1,000 Irish people to Christ. And he famously says, when asked, when he writes his confessions, what is the central theme of his life? Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ below me, Christ above me. It is all Jesus. And beloved, in this culture of death, we have the privilege to come and say, let us introduce to you the one who says, I am the life. Father, I thank you for this assembly, and I pray as we take your words and use it, Lord, for the benefit of the gospel, that you would save many because of our life and our testimony. I ask this in the name of Jesus our Lord and for his sake.